Hello everyone, welcome to a video on boss design in video games, but particularly my indie game, The Feathered Serpent. I'm Matt, and I'm going to be going over a lot of the tips, tricks, and principles of boss design that I've picked up on over the 3 years of development that I've been working on my game in, and just other things I've picked up on from YouTube videos, tutorials, and just playing games in general. And I know that a lot of this information translates over, it bridges genres, it is just really core and foundational, so there's a lot of value to be derived here, even if it differs from how bosses look in my game to your game or to any other game. So let's go and just jump right into it here. We're going to be starting off with the looking at the first boss in my game. It is a Lizard King boss, and this is the splash art for him. I'll go and just show you a clip of me fighting this boss so that we can kind of look at it before I just start rambling and saying all this stuff, so that you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. So this is the Lizard King. As you can see, it looks a bit different here. He has a mask on, and I will be going over that a bit later. But as you can see here, just your traditional looking boss fight here. Big beefy monster, and then you're shooting him, trying to kill him. So let's, and then that was me killing him at the end there, and then switching to the wrong scene. So let's go over a couple of things that I do when I first try and come up with a boss, right? So let's answer this question. It's a very fundamental question. Where do I start when it comes to a boss? So I believe that all bosses should obviously come from your enemies or your hazards. That's where you start. If you're struggling to figure out a boss, look at the things, the mechanics in your game, the enemies, and the hazards that are in your game that players are having to deal with. And that's going to be a great base point for where you're supposed to start with your boss. Where do enemies come from? That's a different video. I assume that people can kind of handle and figure that out. But enemies, in my opinion, come from storytelling. You are trying to tell a story with the hazards and the events and the challenges and the enemies that your player is trying to overcome and get through. So when you're creating a boss, you are trying to replicate a lot of these earlier experiences with enemies, with hazards, and with challenges, just to a higher degree. So in my game, that's exactly where I started. I had my first area, and I was like, okay, how do I tell a compelling story? I was like, well, it'd be cool if they were in a forest and there's these like dinosaurs. And I was like, okay, but what if they were like these dinosaur people? I was like, oh, that's cool, some lizard men. And so I created these enemies here, these lizard men, that the player has to fight in the first area. And they're very simple. They just walk towards the player when they come into line, point of view, a line, what is it called? Line sight? Point of view, line of sight. That's the term, line of sight. If you get too close to him, it triggers this attack animation where he has this telegraphed attack where he raises the sword and he'll slash down in front of you. This is just his walking animation. And they jump. When they come up to a wall, they'll chase you and they'll jump over walls. They'll jump over large gaps. And I have a second variant here. And this lizard man doesn't jump, doesn't chase you down. He walks closer to you if you're too far away. And he throws spears at you from a distance. And he, if you get too close to him, he also stabs you. The last thing is these lizard men come from huts. They're a spawner. Once you destroy the huts in the game, it stops spawning those lizard men. And the last enemy that I'm going to look at here, not the boss, is the monkey. So as you see here, I have this monkey enemy. You shoot him, and then he holds a rock above his head and throws it at you. So even a simple enemy like that, that's not this intense enemy, I took all of those elements and I put them into the Lizard King boss. So coming back to my white page here, when I approached my Lizard King boss, I thought, okay, let's incorporate elements of each of my enemies. So I want him to throw stuff, because that's pulling from the monkey and from the spear lizard. So he's going to be throwing rocks at the main player. But I thought, well, he's going to be huge, so I'll just make the rock big, right? Coming back to what I said at the start, we want to take the same experiences the player had, replicate them, but more intense. Okay, so monkey throws tiny rock. I'm going to have the boss throw a big rock. Spear lizards throw spears and aim it at the player. Okay, the boss is going to throw a spear. So then we have the sword lizards. They walk towards the player, right? So my boss, he moves towards the player. What else happens? Well, if you're too close to the sword lizard, he attacks down at you. My boss, if you get too close to him, he stabs forward. And just like in the sword lizard, how he has this telegraphed attack here where he raises it up, he goes, and then he slashes down. It's the same thing with my boss. He has this telegraphed attack where he will reach back and then stab forward. Bumped my mic there. But let me go and show you some of that, because I do have a different clip for the Lizard King. I believe, nope, not that one. I believe it is this one. Yep, so this one, he doesn't have the mask on. You see him stabbing forward right there. Yep, and there he is jumping, landing on the ground, walking towards the player. So we've already replicated a lot of our enemies' earlier abilities, earlier attacks, just everything with that. Hold on, why isn't this pen working? Hello, did I select something? Oh no? Oh no, I'm on eraser. No, I'm on white, that's why. Okay. So we've already replicated all of that. Coming from a storytelling point of view, I am taking this theme of like lizards and these lizard men, I'm creating a giant one, right? So it's sticking in theme. Oh my gosh, this is so bad. Sticking in theme with my first area. When the player sees the boss, it's cool, but it's also expected in a way. And when the boss is doing these mechanics, in a way it's expected. It's like, oh, okay, like I see that. Now, it's okay to... It is a good base, but it's okay to have other things as well. So, for example, the boss, when he throws a boulder, it breaks into, I believe it's 6 other smaller boulders, right? And they go out in every direction. So that's something new that when the player sees, they have to deal with in the moment. So they're getting a very familiar mechanic. It looks more intense, and then there's a slight twist on it. So that's... This is all stuff that I took into account when making this first boss. Another thing is this first area is when people are first learning the movement in my game. And I really want you to learn the movement. Let me just get rid of this. I really want the player to learn a core skill before allowing them to progress, okay? It's also about teaching your players. You're trying to teach them with the boss fight as well how to play your game. So a pretty core mechanic in my game is wall jumping and wall sliding. So this is what my boss arena looks like. This is where the player is, and this is, you know, where the big boss is coming towards you, okay? So if you don't learn to hop up on the side of the wall, you're going to die. The boss is going to walk into you and kill you. Alternatively, you can learn to go underneath the boss when he jumps over you. It's a little bit more aggressive, and players, a good thing to keep in mind is players probably aren't going to go aggressive when they're first learning a boss. They're going to just naturally play way more hesitant. They're trying to learn, so when you see this guy coming towards you and jumping at you, it is not going to be a player's first instinct to run underneath him. So I'm teaching the player, hey, you got to go on the side of the wall, you got to jump up it, and then you got to jump over the boss. This is an important skill because later on, I have another fight that utilizes a wall as well, and you need to be able to scale that wall. I have areas in my game where, hey, if you don't know how to wall jump, this is going to be a struggle area for you. And I've noticed when a lot of new players play my game, they take this approach where they stand there, and they just, the enemy's like over here, maybe even out of frame, and they'll shoot arrows at him. And that's fine, but that's not going to cut it for the boss, and that's not going to cut it for later areas. It's a very passive way to play the game. So I'm teaching you the more fun way to play the game, but also I'm teaching you how to be a better player and to not be so passive. I'm forcing you to, hey, get good at wall jumps. Get good at, If you're not going to get good at wall jumps, get good at confronting the boss and moving forward and not stepping away. So it's okay, if you're going to be passive, I'm going to teach you how to use this skill. If you're not going to be passive, you're going to learn the skill of aggression and being comfortable being in the presence of enemies. So that's how I went about doing the mechanics for the Lizard King boss. We're going to cut forward now, and we're going to take a look at the next boss here, the plant boss. So in a very similar vein, I thought, okay, I'm in a jungle area. In the jungle, I have these little tiny plants. They're these little green plants, and they shoot out these little fire pellets. You see them a couple times. So I thought, well, it'd be cool if I just did a big one of those. So I did. Okay, let's do a giant plant head. And he's going to be like this. And he's going to shoot out these huge balls of fire. Same exact thing. You're seeing what I'm doing? I'm storytelling. I'm foreshadowing what we're going to do with later on bosses. So you see these tiny plants, and then when you end up seeing the boss, it's cool, it's big, but in a weird way, you're like, I kind of can expect what's going to happen here. Now, we're going to go over here. So these are the plants I'm talking about. That shoot out those tiny little things that I foreshadowed. But also this boss pulls from a mechanic from the first area of the game. There were these dragon statues. It was a trap in the first area in the forest. And if you got too close to them, they breathe out this fire breath. And this plant has the same thing. If you get too close to him, he does a different attack where he shoots out this fire breath. So in a way, I'm doing a callback not only to enemies in the second area of my game, I'm calling it all the way back to the first area. And I'm saying, hey, like stuff you learned at the start of the game, that's going to apply later on. This pulling from other areas makes your game feel more cohesive and complete, more well thought out. You can do that and pull from those different sources. Another thing I did is obviously I wanted to up it, so I thought, hey, one plant head's cool. What if we did 3? So the boss fight contains a grand total of 3. Now, I'm sure you get the idea. I don't want to spend too much time on this, so we'll just cut to the next boss, the Dino Golem. So this was a boss I just finished last week. Actually, honestly, I just finished it a couple days ago. I've still been adding stuff to it. As late as yesterday, I was adding stuff to it. So, okay, what does this Dino Golem boss have to do with anything? Well, he's pulling from an area where there's lots of this green magic. Okay, so I thought, okay, green magic. Also, I'm kind of zoomed in on this page here. Green magic. Okay, it's actually like a more teal looking like this color. Okay, so looking ahead, the enemies that we pull from are... There's a stone dinosaur here. Here's a giant stone dinosaur head. So the enemies in this third area, we already have stone dinosaurs. We have... And these have to do more with the mechanics of adds in the boss fight. So adds is additional enemies. But there are these enemies he spawns right here that are exact copies of these bluebirds that you fight earlier on in the game. And they're just called rock flyers. And he pulls from this enemy that is in the third area, which is a rock elemental. This rock elemental will glow before he does anything once you get near him. And then he creates with this, oh my goodness. I was just saying the word a bunch. Telegraphed move. A boulder will start to glow above him, and then when it forms, he shoots it out. And that boulder looks like this. As a callback to the first boss, when this boulder hits something, it explodes into tinier bullets. So now I'm doing callbacks in the enemies to the first boss. So I took all of those, and I thought, okay, let's create this dino boss, and he's going to shoot out of his hand boulders. But I thought, look, I've already done this twice now, where I take the boulder, and I'm like, bigger, right? That's what I said earlier. Well, I believe, and maybe I'm wrong, this would be super funny I'm wrong, but I believe I was careful about saying more intense, not necessarily bigger. I said the way I made it more intense was by making it bigger. So I have this move with these rocks. How can I make it more intense but not fall into the same trap of I'm just doing the same thing? The boss is always just going to be bigger. Well, instead he shoots out small rocks. super tiny rocks, even smaller than what the elemental shoots out, but he shoots out a bunch of them. We're talking like 20 shots, just all coming at the player. They're scattering around everywhere. Now, this is pertinent because this actually comes from the plant head boss. The plant head boss, and I realize I didn't actually go over this too much, has this big shot, but when you kill one of the heads, the other two heads they rear back, they swell up with these fire sacks, and they shoot out a bunch of tiny shots, like so. A bunch of them. So that is actually a callback. This move right here is a callback to the previous boss you fought. And then lastly, we want to keep players on their toes. So he has an eyeball mouth attack where he fires off a laser. And like, I know this seems like I might be getting lost in the sauce, but I'm just trying to show you the importance of enemies, callbacks, and pulling from mechanics players have already seen, and then introducing maybe one or two new mechanics. So this would be the introduction of a new mechanic. But even then, we've already seen enemies, going back to the beginning here, we have already seen enemies that are made of stone, that look like a dragon or a dinosaur, that shoot something out of their mouths. So even in that sense, it's not necessarily something new. So that's the approach I kind of took to all of these bosses. And looking at the rock golem boss here, you can actually get an idea of what my process for making the boss was, just inherently. So originally it was just this idea. This was the first concept I did. I thought, well, I want him to have weak points. I knew the eye was going to be a weak point. I knew I wanted there to be some sort of attack coming out of his mouth right here. It was originally his nostril. And I knew I wanted flying enemies. You see how they're blue? I wanted those blue flying enemies. I always knew I wanted them to be coming out. There's also these platforms that are moving in the boss fight, and I knew that I wanted that. And I understand that it'd probably be better if I just showed you. This is the golem fight boss. Okay, this is what we're talking about here. He has a laser beam move. He has this hand move that we were talking about where he raises his hand, and he has that move in his chest that you saw spawn those flying enemies. And then he'll raise his head, and he has these weak points we have to hit. And then go into the plant boss. We'll go through this little cutscene here. You see here how I got too close. He shot out that fire. I have these plants spawning where the player stands, and then you can see him shoot out these big fireballs after they charge up. Okay. I then thought, well, there needs to be something like on the ground to stop the player from just standing on the ground. And I originally thought, hey, it'd be cool if there was like an enemy on the inside that you had to kill, like another weak point here. Well, I took this idea and I reformed it about a year later into this. And I took the same idea. I thought, okay, let's do the weak point with the eye. I don't like the idea of there being a dinosaur in the mouth, but it would be cool if there was a laser beam attack. And I thought, okay, what if we did a weak point in the heart? We give him this giant, cool stone golem body, just like all the statues you've been seeing. And we make it so he has an arm that he raises up that shoots out these rocks. So this was actually my entire mock-up for that boss that you just watched. And it honestly, it seems simple, but it contains a lot of information. It contains everything that I needed to make that boss. So we're going to take a step back now. And there's going to be a second section of the video. This is theme. Where we're going to be taking a look at theme, enemies, and we've already touched on all of these, but I'm just going to go over a little bit more. Theme, enemies, and then the actual design of mechanics themselves when it comes to boss fights. So looking at theme, I've already said, hey, we have the theme of lizard men. We had the theme of plants for this second area. And we had the theme of these stone statues and stone golems. So that is always going to be a huge part in boss fights, is you want them to be on theme. It'd be weird to just have you have this whole jungle area, and then the final boss is the stone golem. You're like, what the heck? Or if you have a whole entire city area, and at the very end, it's just like out of nowhere, some random lava monster. It's not saying that it's like it can't work, but usually you want to stick to the theme in the story that you're telling through your characters, through your enemies. In regards to the mechanics and how I talked about how we pull them from the enemies, a more practical thing that I'm going to go over right now is how many mechanics is enough. I have more than just those 3 enemies in my first area, so why don't I just give the boss all the moves? Well, you don't want the player to be overwhelmed. I found that the magic number's 3, okay? You want to try and aim for 3 different mechanics, and you want them to call back or reference earlier mechanics. Like I said, I'm already teaching the player how to fight the first boss just through these enemies. I'm teaching him how to fight the first boss. I'm teaching him how to avoid getting jumped on, how to dodge projectiles. And so that's how I balanced it out with how many mechanics should I choose. My first boss throws the rock. He attacks the player if they get too close, and he jumps. That's all he does. So going down a level, even more in depth, why did I choose these 3? Well, one thing that most players tend to do when they play my game is they run away. So I'm like, okay, the boss is slow. I can either make my boss run really fast to compensate and go and try and catch up with the player, but that's just hard and can feel frustrating. And it makes people panic. Or I can give the boss a way to hit a player that is running far away. I was like, okay, that's easy. I'll opt for that. Let me have something where the boss is going to throw something at the player. Another thing is, there's the side of the wall. How do I stop players from just sitting at the top and just bouncing at the top? I don't have to worry the boss can't reach up and get me. You can do that with the smaller enemies. There's jumps that they can't make. You can just sit there and shoot them. Well, to solve that, I can also use the throw attack. So you can throw something at the player if they're just stuck up on the wall. So I'm like, okay, we're doing the throw. That solves problems that I can already foresee with my gameplay. So I'm thinking about what the player can do. I'm saying, what mechanic can I introduce to stop the player from playing something that isn't that kind of makes the game not fun. With the other ones, obviously he needs to close the space, and I need one where if you're right up next to the boss, he gets you away from him. If you're right up in his face, he's going to hit you. He's going to attack you. That's a given. And then the jumping was, well, I need a way for the player to get on the opposite side of the boss. So the one way is this, jumping up. But the other way could be going underneath him. And it's also a callback from a different enemy. The jump also helps because he can jump up and hit you up here. It is not a safe place to be on the side of the wall if he jumps up and gets you. So it's another attack that can prevent that strategy. Now, I'm not saying prevent fun. You don't want to design your game to prevent fun. But you want to think of things or ways people could play your game that would cheese your mechanics or make it not fun, and you want to design your boss or your encounter to solve those problems. So those are the problems I was solving. Moving forward, we can go over the other bosses and how I did that real quick. We have the giant plant monster. Okay. So what were his 3 mechanics? He shoots a big ball of fire. If you get too close to him, he shoots out a breath of fire. And when one of the heads dies, they shoot out a wave of fire. Now, the arena looks like this. Okay? You saw it. We have the 3 heads right here. The player stands right here. And then I put an acid pit at the bottom, right? So let me go over a couple of subtle things that I did as I was building this boss fight. And it's cool because if you actually go to my streams, you can watch this happen in real time. So, yeah, we're just going to get rid of all of that. So, one problem that I had was, hey, and this is, I'm going to walk you through because this is one of the best ones, in my opinion. And this is going to be super valuable, I promise. So, I have this side wall that the player can jump up. I have this sort of body that goes up like this, and I have these 3 plant heads, okay? So one problem that I had is when these plants are shooting fireballs at you, okay? They're shooting fireballs at the player. A big problem that I ran into was the player can run underneath them. And then these fireballs can't hit the player, right? And the player can just sit underneath them and shoot them. So I went, well, I need to create an acid pit. And so it used to just be stone. I created an acid pit. Okay. Now, players can't stand. I think the acid pit goes all the way over to here. Players can't stand underneath him. So it worked for a little bit until I was playtesting my fight, and you kill the first boss. Okay, you kill him. He's done. So now what? Now what's the problem? Well, a couple problems, right? One thing is, and I forgot to say this with the Lizard King boss, when you're designing a boss, if you have a movable character, you want to do everything you can to make sure that that player has to be moved. So a big red flag when you're making a boss fight is if I am not moving, if I can just stand in one position, you got to fix it. The player should have to be moving. So with my Lizard King, he's constantly walking towards you. He's constantly, he's throwing things at you. You can't get away with just standing in one place because he will push you out of that place. I'm forced to move. So the problem with this plant boss fight is they're shooting fireballs at me, right? Psh, psh, psh. But I can pretty much, for the most part, just walk back and forth. Just doop, boop. I don't even have to move. And then I could just hop up the wall, and it's even easier, right? I barely have to move in order to kill all these heads. So I went, well, shoot. I need this player to move. So I put in moving platforms to encourage the player, hey, you got to move. So I believe I have one here. I have one here that goes up. I have one that goes over here, one that goes over here, and one that goes over here. And this one goes like this. So these platforms, if the player shoots them, your bolt does not go through it. So this actually was done on purpose because now if the player just stands here, it's hard to hit this top plant. It's okay when trying to hit this plant because these platforms are moving and they get in the way. Now, the player can then so now the player's incentivized, hey, I'm going to stand on the platform a little bit. So you stand on the platform and it moves towards this boss. But now the problem is this boss, his bullet gets stopped by the platform. Yeah, I can just stand on the topmost platform and I'm pretty much protected. So I thought, well, that also kind of sucks. So I made it so their big fireballs destroy the platforms. Then the platforms come back after a few seconds. So as I'm trying to solve these problems, and in trying to solve it, I created a problem, then I have to solve it. But it makes for really cool and interesting mechanics. Now, another way to incentivize people to stand on these platforms was I added in plant spawners. There's 3 of them on the bottom, and then there's a couple on the wall. So these will periodically create those smaller green plants that we had seen earlier. And this makes it more hectic for the player because now he has to watch out for not just the bosses, but for these smaller enemies. Now, this takes me to the second section that I was going over here. Part of the mechanics of the boss is you want 3 moves and you need adds. So add stands for additional enemies, I'm pretty sure. Don't fact check me on that. But that's what it stands for me. So it's not enough to just have the sword lizard, or the lizard king here, I mean. So I put in spawners that create in the boss fight area these 2 enemies. And I did the same thing with the plant area. I went, hey, I'm going to create these plants. and they can spawn out of these little plant things that are like, it's kind of like this root system, you know? It's like creating these plants. And this adds a whole new element to the fight where I can't just, you know, focus on the boss the whole time. I have to be aware of my surroundings, okay? There are other things that pop up that I have to deal with that derail me. But these things that derail me are things that I have dealt with before. So it's not like this total like new mechanic. It's just, okay, I've dealt with these enemies before, but I have to deal with them. Otherwise the fight becomes unmanageable. So this is a great way to break up the monotony of the boss. And oh, I'm just fighting this one thing by bringing in those hazards, those mechanics, those challenges that you've already established in your levels. So this was another huge incentive to get the player off the wall, off the ground, and onto these platforms. And then having these fireballs destroy the platforms creates a fun dynamic where I'm constantly falling back down. And I have to be careful to not fall into the acid. And I have to be careful to make sure that these enemies are cleared so that when I do fall, I don't die and get hit by an enemy. Now there's one last problem. I know that was a lot. There's one last problem here. The player could stand on this platform, kill the first head, and then stand right here. Right? He could stand underneath once again and just shoot the bosses to death. So the way I fixed that was I made it, once you kill a boss, there's a little wound, a little hole. These create these fire things, and they don't go out far, but it's just enough to rain down on this first area. So there's no standing underneath the boss. These things are shooting out fire. So that way, no matter what head I kill, I can't come and cheese the boss. I can't cheese it from above. I can't cheese it from below. And lastly, the third mechanic here, like I said, when a head dies, they shoot out this crazy, this huge just wave of bullets. Now this is fun because once again it forces the player to make sure that this area is cleared. You need verticality to deal with the move, this attack. So I have to manage the ads. And this also shows the player, hey, I need to learn how to deal with these small bullets, but also I can use these platforms to my advantage because these bullets don't go through those platforms. So it's all this fun like push and pull of like, here's these mechanics and here's this, and there's so much that's going to go into it. But when you approach your boss fights, just like I did here, genuinely try and think about it, play your game, and try and break your game. Try and be the player who try to not move. Try to just cheese the fight. Don't play the fight how you think it should be played. Play the fight in like the easiest way possible. And then throw in mechanics to disrupt the player. You don't want to make, once again, we're not trying to stop fun. We're not trying to necessarily get in the player's way, but we're trying to prevent the game from being boring. We don't want the player to just stand there. We don't want them to find a safe spot. We want them to have to deal with these issues and actually engage with the game. Lastly, I did the same process with the Dino Golem boss. I didn't want him on the ground, so I created spikes on the ground, and these spikes go up and down periodically, so sometimes you can be on the ground. I had moving platforms, and I decided that the moving platforms here, I was going to let the player shoot through them, because the boss himself cannot be shot through, and he has weak points. And so I wanted the player to get verticality really easily, but I didn't want that to hinder the player. Once again, this boss fight also has the enemies he spawns, those flying enemies that come towards the player that he has to deal with. And it has at least 3 moves. It has an eye beam, or the eye/mouth beam. It has the heart spawn, which it spawns those enemies. And it has the hand that shoots out a bunch of rocks, a bunch of tiny rocks. So, and like I said, this came with this whole different set of challenges in regards to, okay, how do I prevent the player from just standing at the very top? Well, there's a laser. How do I prevent the player from standing on the bottom? Well, there's spikes. How do I prevent the player from getting screwed over by RNG? Well, I have 4 platforms at the bottom that don't move, that they break, but they always respawn and come back. So it's this, once again, this push and pull of how can I make, the fight fun and disrupt the movement of the player and make them engage more. So every single one of these fights has additional enemies. They each have at least 3 mechanics. And the last thing that they all have is progression. Okay? This is another thing that is important in every fight, but also I think if you're doing a roguelite, this is also important. So as I'm beating this boss, for example, the sword lizard, after I've beaten him 7 times, he starts spawning with a skull on his head. Now, when he has the skull on his head, he has significantly more health. And I can show you the thing here. Oh, no, not this. This is him normally. When you fight him later on, he has a skull. As you shoot at him, the skull slowly breaks off his face. And when the skull cracks, he gets faster. And he starts animating faster, and his moves go off faster. And when he breaks and has no skull at all, he gets even faster. So there's a progression to the fight. The fight is getting harder. He's animating faster. Excuse me. His moves are going off faster. So that's a really easy way. It's kind of the bare minimum, but that is an easy way to have progression in your fight. I've also opted to have progression in between runs. So like I said, the first 7 times you fight the boss, he doesn't have the skull. And then, well, actually, it's the first 3 times you fight the boss, he doesn't even have any ads. There's no even additional enemies. I'm just teaching you the boss fight. After 3 times, 2 huts spawn in the fight. And then you have to start dealing with, oh, there's other enemies I have to deal with in this fight. And then by the 7th time, oh, there's other enemies, and he has a mask on now. So it's like, okay, the fight's progressing. I'm adding in more mechanics. This is something that Hades does really well. With the giant plant monster, the first time you fight him, he's only going to have 2 heads. As you kill each head, the other heads start attacking and animating faster. With the Dino Golem boss, I guess it doesn't really show here, but if you break his eyeball, the other 2, his chest and his hand, they start spawning more enemies, the chest, and the hand starts firing off not only more, but more intensely. It goes from shooting out of like 20 rocks to 50 rocks very fast. And then let's say you destroy the chest after that, the hand starts shooting off like 100 rocks. So the player actually has some choice here where, depending on the order I'm killing these vulnerable spots, the boss fight is going to change and react to the player's choices. If I kill the chest and the hand first, the eye and the mouth, or the laser beam, starts moving, and he moves up and down. And so it's adding in these different layers of complexity. And look, I know that this video is very ranty, but I just wanted to make this video saying everything I did and getting all of it out there. And I apologize if it's longer than you thought. It's definitely longer than I thought. 37 minutes. That's crazy. So lastly, so that's how I approach the boss, okay? You want progression in your boss fight. You want progression in your boss moves. You want the moves to be based on the previous levels. You want there to be storytelling with your boss. And you want to disrupt the player and really think from the player's perspective of how can I cheese this fight. And you want to throw in mechanics. You want to throw in moves that disrupt that so that the player can't just stand there and do nothing. Well, stand there and just shoot at the boss and not have to move and not engage with the mechanics. The last thing that we're going to do is talk about player info. Okay? So we want to give as much information to the player as possible. And we talked about telegraphing, this idea of, hey, your boss should have this wind up to his moves. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and open, I should have done this before, but I'm going to go ahead and open up 2 of the bosses here. Lizard King. So as you can see here, he has a charge up. And I know I could probably just show you the video, but I just want to show you. He has a charge up, and he flickers between these 2 frames before he stabs you. When he goes to jump in the air, he crouches, and then he jumps. He crouches beforehand, and he waits there for half a second. When he goes to throw something at you, he struggles at the ground, pulling something out of the ground before, before throwing a rock at you. All of the moves are telegraphed. Even the enemies that spawn, you want that to be telegraphed. So the hut actually has in the boss fight, I believe I can show you. Maybe I don't have the proper footage for it. I'm checking here. So this is outdated footage, but I have hued down the huts to indicate that, hey, they're part of the background. I took the background blue color and I hued them down. And then when they spawn enemies, exclamation point appears above them, and a ringing will go, and it gets faster and faster until it spawns the enemy. In regards to the plant boss, those little plant spawners all around, they will change color, they flash, and they beep at the player, beep, 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 before they spawn an enemy. Also, looking at the plant boss, I can go and open up the plant boss enemy here. Right here. If we look at his attacks, you see he swells up, his cheek puffs up, and he glows. And I actually have added in a glow that animates on top of him. That is always there. This glow happens before he attacks, before he shoots out his moves. There's charge up, there's wind up sounds, and then he shoots it out. So this idea of telegraphing is important. And you should keep in mind, you want to telegraph in 3 ways, okay? You want to telegraph because the player has seen it before with enemies. Whether it's... we've already been over this, but the enemy's mechanics should make it into the boss fight in one way or another, in some form, in some way. So that's one way to telegraph. I've seen it before. I've seen the monkey lift something up above his head and throw it. So I know when the boss lifts something up, he's going to throw it. You want to telegraph it visually. You want to wait. You want to be generous to the player. You want to show that the boss is rearing up, that there's a pattern you can recognize before just doing the move. And lastly, you want sound. I would argue you need these 3 things. You need it to have already happened in one way or another. You need it to be visual. And you need to tell it through sound, whether that's a growl, whether that's a charge-up sound, or even just a high-pitched beep. Now, I do this in every fight, but we don't have to go over that. I think I've already said enough there. I have these sticky notes on my computer of points I wanted to touch on. So telegraphing. And this is the more direct way. There's an indirect way to telegraph, which is in the splash art and in the art itself. So if I look at the Dino Golem, wow, his mouth is glowing. Wow, this eye is glowing. That's interesting. Like, I'm already telling the player before they've seen the boss, look, this is a move that could happen. He's glowing. He's probably going to shoot something out of his mouth. In the plant enemy, look at this, a glowing mouth. And then there's fire coming out of this plant's mouth. And you can even see how they're charging up, and they have these different sacks right here. I'm already telling the player information about what is going to happen in the splash art. And lastly, the intro itself. So let me go and play you an intro from the 3rd boss here. So this is the introduction that plays before the 3rd boss. As you can see, this laser beam breaks down this wall. The player runs forward, and then it shows the boss head there. I'm telegraphing before you even have to fight the boss. Look at this laser beam move. Look at that. Like, don't get hit. It shows the player running away from it. So there's ways to show off the boss's moves and to give the player an idea of what's going on before they've even seen the boss or fight the boss. And that's important to do to make a game just feel more cohesive. Yeah. So that's like all I have for my notes. Some last little things I'll stick in here for those of you who made it to the very end. When you're creating a boss, trying to aim anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes, I would argue. It seems short, but this is a long time when you're playing a game. Okay. I know a lot of games that are more focused on bosses tend to have longer boss fights, like Dark Souls. But even then, in Dark Souls, like, you're looking at like 8 to 10 minutes. And this is like, when you really know what you're doing in Dark Souls, you can kill a boss in like 5 minutes. You can kill bosses fast. I would try and avoid, maybe 2 is almost too small. Maybe you go 3 to 5 minutes. This does depend on your game more. For example, in the Feathered Serpent, I'm aiming at like 2 minutes for the first boss fight, 4 minutes for the second one, 6 minutes for the third one, 8 minutes for the fourth one, 10 minutes for the last one. They're increasing in scale. And I'm doing this for accessibility reasons. I don't want the player to have a ridiculously hard first experience with the first boss. Because when looking at, go to your favorite game. This works for any game. It works for any and every game. Go to its achievements. You probably have to go to its Steam page. It's going to have an achievement that says like first boss killed. Right? And then it'll have a second boss killed. This first boss is probably like anywhere from 70 to 80%, right? 20% of people aren't even going to make it to your first boss. Second boss, it's going to drop 50 to 60. Third boss, you're looking at anywhere from 30. I've seen it go 30 to 50. Once people get past your third boss, usually they'll make it relatively far. But when it comes to the last boss, you're only looking at 20 or 10 to 20% of people. This is just what I've observed in games. So I want as many people to get to this first boss and beat it as possible. And then once it gets these later bosses, I already know the trend of players. I can start, I don't have to worry about, oh, shoot, like, I don't want to make it too hard. I don't want to make it, like, the players are going to, if they make it down here, they're probably going to go all the distance, Anyways, I'm rambling. That's my approach to boss design. I know for a fact I've missed things, but this is all the information that I've been able to think up of. I think it's pretty sound, solid advice. I think a lot of these things most people know, but it's nice to hear out loud. A lot of that stuff that I was talking about, foreshadowing with enemies and earlier mechanics, that's stuff that is present in almost every single game. This idea of teaching your players mechanics in the boss fights that they then use later on, also that's in almost every single game. And then the idea of using those boss mechanics for enemies later on, all of that is just going to blend so well together to make a really cohesive feeling game. Bosses that feel like they fit in your world, and a world that feels like it reflects the bosses. And it's just going to be better. Your players are going to learn your bosses better. They're going to engage with them in more meaningful ways. Honestly, my 2 biggest pieces of advice: make your boss match the enemies in your game, the hazards, the challenges in your game. And the last piece of advice is, I just thought of it. Now I'm blanking. Just let my brain cook. It was match the enemies. And teach your player. Maybe. That doesn't sound right. But those are important. Matching your enemies, matching those earlier signs. Oh no, I remember what I was going to say. Teaching the player is important, but it's important to disrupt the player and make them engage. You want the player to move. You don't want the player to be stagnant. You don't want the player to be able to cheese your boss. You want the player to have to engage with the mechanics no matter what. Even if the player has the most busted build in the game. They're super good at the game. They're advanced. They got the item that gives them 20 attack damage. You still want them to have to engage with the boss and the boss's mechanics. That's how you know you've made a good boss. And I'll leave it there. Thank you everyone for watching. I tried to make this as professional as possible while also saving my brain and my efficiency and time by not having to edit it. Also, I don't think this video needed to be edited necessarily. Maybe it did. Just with the formation of my thoughts. I thought it was going to make a 20-minute video. We're approaching 50 minutes, so I'll end it here. Thank you everyone for watching. Like I said, I'm sure I missed things, so tell me what your approach is to boss design, things that you've picked up and noticed in the comments below. I'd love to read it, and then maybe I can revisit this video or put some of those things in my game. But This is just what I've observed and what's worked for me. Thank you for watching. Have a great rest of your week, and come stop by the streams. I stream 7:30. Well, I try and start streaming at 7:30 a.m. Mountain Standard Time to 3:30 Monday through Friday, and then sometimes Saturday, just depending. Thank you, everyone. See ya.